Welcome to NVC Life. I'm Rachelle Lamb, veteran NVC trainer and relationship coach, helping listeners navigate interpersonal conflict and ground more deeply into relational living. Greetings, fellow humans. Are you being authentic? Now, authentic is a word that is widely used in our time. There's a lot of focus on whether or not people are being authentic. And so I thought it would be good to examine that one because it's often framed in a manner where we're thinking that, of course, you want to be authentic. That's the only way you can be. Being authentic implies that you're doing something good for the world. You're doing something good for yourself. And I'm not so sure about that. So here's how I'm going to frame it. I'd like to look at it in terms of levels of maturity, meaning, for instance, a child is being authentic when they're throwing a tantrum. And yet, when an adult does that same kind of behavior, and adults do throw tantrums very often in their very close interpersonal relationships, when they do that, they can make the mistake of thinking that that's being authentic. And I'd like to challenge that and see what are the different types of authenticity. Being yourself when you're being an asshole, is that a kind of authenticity to be proud of? Versus being yourself when you're making an effort to speak and act in ways that are in alignment with your values. Now, this is a tricky thing too, because what I just said is a widely held definition of what it means to be authentic. But what if your values are skewed? What if your values have to do with me first and I don't care about anybody else? That level of authenticity is not the kind that we would strive for. Being authentic when you're essentially being self-centered versus being authentic when you're considering others and the well-being of the world. These are distinctly different things. The other way to understand authenticity is that there are times when doing what is right for others, for yourself, for the world, might actually get you into trouble. It might not be what is trafficked by mainstream culture. And so to step outside of that can be pretty uncomfortable. So let's look at that. Let's look at being authentic in a way that is mature authenticity. And I think it would be fair to say that there are certain qualities that we ascribe to that kind of authenticity. Being honest and real, being sincere, and it often includes a vulnerability, risk-taking, courage, and the strength and resolve to get back up when you mess up and when you fall down. And I believe that these traits and qualities are essentially rooted in one's desire to contribute meaningfully to life and to the quality of one's relationships. So this is a very different way of understanding authenticity, and the one that is most likely what people have in mind when they're actually speaking about authenticity. But I think we need to be cautious because it's problematic when we conflate mature authenticity with other types of behavior, such as being impulsive, being spontaneous, being uncensored, speaking freely. Because I can tell you that in my work with people, these are often the words that people will use when they're under a lot of pressure, in particular with another person. So if I'm doing a mediation, for instance, with a couple, and one of them is, I'm just going to describe it right now as poor behavior. They're not taking responsibility for their own feelings in the way that we encourage people to do with nonviolent communication. There will often be some distorted thinking that's going on or distorted evaluations of what's going on. A lot of misinterpretations, a lot of projections onto the other person. And what they will often say are things like, hey, this is who I am. I have a right to be myself. I have a right to tell you what's true for me. I have a right to tell you that you are being dismissive of me, that you're putting me down, that you're being manipulative, even when none of that is actually what's going on. And so I would ask that person to speak more deeply, to peel that layer off so that they can actually be authentic. Because in a moment like that, to be authentic would be, and to be really honest with oneself, it would have a much different tone. It would be saying something more like, I'm scared right now to fully see and know myself. I'm scared to encounter this part of myself that is so scared right now in this moment of conflict. I'm afraid that if I do see things in the right light or in a way that's purely objective, I won't have a leg to stand on anymore, and I will have to take care of myself. I'll have to learn how to manage my own distress that comes up from the narratives, the distorted narratives that I tell myself. So this is why I think it's so important to make that distinction when we do speak about authenticity, because I think authenticity, the kind that we aspire to, requires a lot of soul searching. It requires that we look inwardly and we see how we have responded in certain ways to certain people in the past, how we do it in the present moment, noticing what fears rise up, noticing the judgments that come up and the narratives that we spin out of what we see. So that is to be authentic, to report candidly on what's going on inside oneself, even when there's some fear there. And you would start by acknowledging that. I always remember Marshall Rosenberg saying, unexpressed fear is almost always interpreted as aggression. And I think this is very true, that when we don't start by saying we're afraid, when we actually are afraid, there's a lot of positioning that's taking place. We're trying to get out of actually speaking directly to what is happening for us and to do it in a clean and clear way. So instead, we can start screaming and raging at our partner as if it's all their fault that we are feeling the way we are feeling. On my website, when people sign up for my newsletter, they receive a copy of Communicating During Conflict, 4 Key Steps. And it's essentially a summary of nonviolent communication. It includes what disconnects and what approach to take in order to speak in a way that's less likely to create defensiveness in others and in ourselves. And one of the things I do speak about in there is on being authentic. You know, people often believe that they cannot be authentic when they're advised to track and restrain their primary impulses, to lash out and speak freely. This is a huge error. Never confuse impulsive reactions as being authentic. Sometimes they are, but it's not always a kind of authenticity that we appreciate being on the receiving end of. So it's important to remember that people very often regret the things they say and do impulsively. Pure emotion without discernment and without reflection is not who we are. Maladaptive habits are not who we are. Relational skill building is a discipline. Authenticity is a discipline. It requires that we learn how healthy relating actually works, not how we want it to work, but how it actually works. And being authentic means learning what our habits are. Most of us have developed habits during our childhood and formative years which wreak havoc in adult relationships. And it's incredibly tragic to witness a person pushing away the very love and connection they so desperately seek. We need to replace maladaptive responses with healthy adult responses. And this takes time. It takes work. In order to break free from a negative pattern, one must be willing to see how they actively generate and perpetuate negative patterns. They must be brutally honest with themselves about the role they play in the unhealthy dynamic and take concrete steps to change. And one of the things I'll see when I'm working with people is that, hey, I'm a good communicator. It's the other person who's not a good communicator. And if that's what you're thinking, stop. Think about what you do. Looking at what you do is the work. It's easy to feel strongly about what the other person needs to do to improve their relationship with us. If they would only do this or do that, then the relationship would work. Then we could trust them. Then we could be nice to them. Then we could be kind to them. But changing others isn't the work. The work is facing ourselves. And this is how we get to be authentic, is by facing ourselves and seeing ourselves in action and learning what are the ways that we can better express who we are and better align with what's important to us, but also what's needed in the world. It's not enough to just stop at, hey, this is what I want and this is what I value, because our values can be pretty skewed. They can be hugely infected by malignant self-interest and exploitation of others and of the world. While it may be noble in most instances to encourage authenticity, it's also important to look at what does the authenticity serve? What is your life in service to? Okay, well, I've said a few things there, and I think I'm just going to stop here. And let's go to a poem, which is a beautiful poem by Mary Oliver that does have to do with authenticity, and it's called The Journey. One day, you finally knew what you had to do and began, though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice, though the whole house began to tremble and you felt the old tug at your ankles. Mend my life, each voice cried. But you didn't stop. You knew what you had to do, though the wind pried with its stiff fingers at the very foundations, though their melancholy was terrible. It was already late enough and a wild night, and the road full of fallen branches and stones. But little by little, as you left their voice behind, the stars began to burn through the sheets of clouds, and there was a new voice which you slowly recognized as your own, that kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world, determined to do the only thing you could do, determined to save the only life that you could save. Mary Oliver, The Journey. And that concludes this week's episode. Are you living your authentic life? Thank you for tuning into NVC Life. For future episodes, be sure to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or YouTube. For free resources or to book a private session with me, head over to RachelleLamb.com. Until the next time, stay sane, grateful, and generous.